There is a harbor wall in Italy. It has sat in seawater for 2,000 years. By every rule we teach in modern engineering, it should be rubble by now. Salt water destroys concrete. That is not a debate. That is chemistry. Modern reinforced piers often fail within a single century in seawater. This wall isn't crumbling. Somewhere inside it, cracks are closing on their own. No one repaired it. No engineer has touched it in centuries. 2,000 miles away, a corroded lump of bronze sat on a seafloor. It sat there for that same 2,000 years. Divers pulled it up in 1901 and had no idea what they held. For decades, it sat in a drawer, mistaken for scrap metal. This is case file number 7. 8 objects, 8 beliefs your ancestors held with total quiet confidence. Every single one was dismissed, at some point, as superstition or coincidence. Historians, doctors, and engineers each dismissed a different one, separately. Every single one turned out to be correct. One case in this file genuinely unsettled me while I researched it. It has nothing to do with objects, machines, or ancient formulas. I won't tell you which yet. You'll feel it when it arrives. 8 cases. Let's open the file. Here is the pattern connecting everything you are about to hear. We assume ancient knowledge was guesswork, corrected later by real science. The evidence, case after case, says the opposite happened. People without our instruments ran long, patient experiments of their own. They watched outcomes for generations. They kept what worked. They discarded what didn't, quietly without ever writing down a theory. No peer review existed. No journals existed. Only results, watched carefully. Somewhere along the way, we decided to call that folklore instead. Here is a fact to sit with before we start. Several objects in this file sat mislabeled in museum storage for decades. One was almost thrown away. One was called a toy. One was dismissed as superstition, right up until 2023. Your own medicine cabinet depends on at least 2 discoveries in this file. So does your bloodstream, whether you realize it or not. Remember the case I mentioned at the start of this file. It is still coming. Watch for it. 8 field reports. 8 objects. Let's start. Case 1. Pozzuoli, Italy. Roman harbor concrete built starting around 79 BCE. Roman builders mixed volcanic ash, quicklime, and seawater into their concrete. Ancient writer Vitruvius described the mixture as improving with age, growing tougher over time. Modern builders read that and assumed it was pride, not physics. Concrete doesn't get stronger, it only degrades year after year. Yet these harbor structures are still standing, unreinforced, after 2,000 years. Some sit directly in crashing surf, taking wave impact every single day. No steel rebar holds them together. No modern additive was ever used. In 2023, MIT scientist Admir Masick examined Roman concrete samples. He used high-resolution electron microscopy to look inside the material. He found small, bright white mineral deposits, called lime clasts, scattered throughout. For decades, other researchers assumed these clasts were a manufacturing flaw. They thought it was evidence of sloppy mixing. Nothing more interesting than that. Masick's team proved the opposite was true. When cracks form, rainwater or seawater reaches these lime clasts directly. The water triggers a chemical reaction inside the crack itself. Lime dissolves, then recrystallizes, sealing the crack from the inside out. The Romans never had a word for this process. We do now. Masick's lab recreated the formula and tested it under controlled conditions. Cracked samples sealed themselves within weeks of contact with water. Geologist Murray Jackson at the University of Utah found something else remarkable. A rare mineral called aluminous tobermorite was forming inside the concrete. That mineral normally forms deep underground under intense heat, over millennia. Here it was forming in harbor walls, at seawater temperature, within decades. Structures near Baiae still show this reaction actively happening today. Modern cement production generates roughly 8% of global carbon emissions. It also typically fails within a single century of use. Several engineering firms now study the Roman formula for exactly this reason. They want longer-lasting, lower-carbon concrete for coastal construction projects. The Romans built a material that treats damage as a wound, not a flaw to hide, but an injury to close. That is one object behaving like it was built to outlive us. Watch closely because the next one was built to outthink us. Case 2, Antikythera wreck, Greece. Bronze mechanism dated to roughly 100 BCEs. Sponge divers found a shipwreck off a Greek island in 1900. They pulled up a corroded lump of bronze the following year. For decades, museum staff assumed it was part of a clock. Some guessed it was scrap metal from a much later century. Nobody seriously believed ancient Greek craftsmen could build true precision machinery. The fragment sat in an Athens museum drawer for most of a century. Curators cataloged it, photographed it, and largely moved on to other artifacts. Almost no one thought it was worth serious further study. In 2006, a team led by Tony Freeth used CT scanning. Freeth works at University College London, studying ancient technology. His team scanned the corroded fragments at very high resolution. Inside, they found more than 30 separate interlocking bronze gears. Some gear teeth were smaller than a single grain of rice. Historians assumed that precision didn't exist until the Renaissance. Centuries later, the mechanism modeled the sun, the moon, and 5 visible planets. It could predict solar and lunar eclipses years in advance. It even tracked the 4-year cycle of the ancient Olympic Games. Nothing this complex reappears in the historical record for over 1,000 years. Physicist Derek de Sola Price first suspected this back in the 1970s. He used early X-ray imaging, decades before CT scanning existed. It took 30 more years and better technology to prove him right. Later scans found over 3,000 characters of hidden Greek text. The text is essentially an instruction manual for reading the sky. The gear train even includes a differential mechanism, a genuine engineering surprise. Historians long assumed that design first appeared in 18th century European clockwork. An ongoing international project keeps scanning the fragments for hidden detail. This wasn't scrap pulled from a shipwreck. It was a working model of the sky, built before anyone thought that possible. Here is why that matters. If they could build that in secret, what else did we misfile as primitive? Case 3, Nile Delta and Mesopotamia. Willow bark remedies documented as early as 1500 BCE. Ancient Egyptian and Sumerian healers chewed raw willow bark for pain. Sometimes they brewed it into a bitter tea instead. The Ebers Papyrus, an Egyptian medical text, lists the remedy plainly. It sits alongside dozens of other plant-based treatments in the same document. Hippocrates recommended willow leaf tea centuries later for the same purpose. He suggested it specifically for pain relief during childbirth. In 1763, an English clergyman named Edward Stone tried something new. He fed dried willow bark to 50 feverish patients in his parish. He reported his results directly to the Royal Society in London. Even with that formal report on file, doctors mostly ignored it. For a full century afterward, this remained dismissed as folk medicine. Stone's own report used the word experiment, yet doctors read it as anecdote. In the early 1800s, chemists isolated a bitter compound from the bark. They named this compound salicin, after the willow's scientific name. Researchers found salicin converts inside the body into salicylic acid. That acid reduces pain, fever, and inflammation on contact with tissue. In 1897, Bayer chemist Felix Hoffmann refined a gentler version of it. He called the new compound acetylsalicylic acid, easier on the stomach. By 1899, Bayer was selling it commercially under a brand new name. You know that name today. It is sitting in your medicine cabinet. The active ingredient hasn't changed in 3,500 years. Separately, several Native American communities used similar bark and root remedies. There was no contact between these two populations, ever, across that time. Two unconnected groups converged on the same pain-relieving compound in nature. Neither population knew the other existed. Neither shared a single written word. We didn't invent aspirin. We spent 3,000 years finally isolating what the bark had already been doing. That is not the strange part. The strange part is how long we dismissed the plant. It told us exactly where to look. Case 4. Central Andes, Peru. Quipu recording cords, used from roughly 2500 BCE onward. Inca administrators kept elaborate knotted cords called quipu. Each cord used specific colors, positions, and knot types to encode, meaning these cords traveled across an empire stretching thousands of miles. That empire had no written alphabet in use anywhere, at any level. Spanish colonizers arrived in the 1500s and mostly dismissed the cords. Some called them primitive counting beads, nothing more sophisticated than that. Others destroyed quipu outright, treating them as pagan ritual objects. Thousands of surviving quipu ended up scattered across museums worldwide. For centuries, they sat uncatalogued, treated as curiosities rather than documents. Some were even labeled simply as textile fragments, with no further note attached. Harvard anthropologist Gary Urton spent over 2 decades studying surviving quipu. He developed a binary-style notation system to analyze their structure, knot direction, cord color, and spacing combined to encode real information. This isn't a simple tally system for counting goods or animals. Some quipu record census data down to the individual household. Others record tribute payments across regions separated by entire mountain ranges. Urton cross-referenced hundreds of cords against known Spanish colonial ledgers. In several cases, the quipu numbers matched those ledgers almost exactly. That confirmed the cords were genuine, functioning administrative documents. No guesswork was required, no symbolic reading. The numbers simply matched. A 2017 discovery paired a quipu with a woven textile. This was found in the Chachapoya region of northern Peru. It hints the two recording systems may have worked together. More than 1,000 surviving quipu are now cataloged worldwide. Harvard maintains an ongoing digital database attempting to decode more of them. Researchers still can't fully read most of these chords today. You are living in the middle of an active decipherment project. An empire the size of Rome ran its accounting on knotted chords. Museums almost threw those chords away. We're halfway through this file. The next case is the one I genuinely could not stop thinking about. Case 5. Multiple regions prehistoric era through modern battlefields. Maggot debridement therapy. Healers across many cultures noticed something disturbing about certain wounds. Ancient Maya communities noted this. So did later military surgeons. Wounds infested with fly larvae sometimes healed cleaner than untouched wounds. They also seemed to heal noticeably faster in some documented cases. Napoleon's chief surgeon, Dominique Larrey, recorded this directly among wounded soldiers. He noted it among men left on the battlefield overnight, untreated. Similar reports surfaced independently among Aboriginal Australian healing traditions as well. For most of medical history, this stayed a grim battlefield coincidence. Nobody treated it as a deliberate, repeatable medical technique worth studying. It simply looked disturbing, and disturbing things got ignored, not researched. During World War I, Surgeon William Baer documented this pattern carefully. Soldiers with neglected maggot-infested wounds showed less infection than treated ones. Baer found the larvae consume only dead and infected tissue. They leave healthy, living tissue completely untouched during that process. Later, biochemical research confirmed something else about the larvae themselves. They secrete compounds with measurable antibacterial and wound-healing properties. One compound, called allantoin, actively encourages new tissue growth at the wound. In 2004, the FDA formally approved medical-grade maggots as a treatment device. Hospitals now use them specifically for wounds resistant to standard antibiotics. That is the exact scenario ancient and wartime healers stumbled into by accident. They had no lab, no culture plate, and no idea why it worked. A company called Monarch Labs now supplies sterile larvae to hospitals directly. They arrive sealed in small mesh pouches, shipped overnight on request. The mechanism is still the one Larry observed with the naked eye. He had no microscope. He had no theory of infection at all. He simply trusted what he watched happen over and over on real wounds. The detail that unsettled battlefield surgeons for centuries is now a cleared, cataloged medical product. Watch closely. The next case has nothing to do with objects at all. It is about memory itself. Case 6. Coastal Australia. Aboriginal oral traditions describing coastlines that no longer exist. Dozens of Aboriginal communities tell stories about ancestors walking on lost land. Some stories describe islands as once being connected hills nearby. These hills were reachable on foot, in a single day's walk. Colonial-era researchers filed nearly all of this under simple mythology. They assumed no oral story could survive that long without changing. Human memory, passed only by voice, was assumed to degrade quickly. Most researchers expected total distortion within a few hundred years at most. Oral history, by that assumption, simply couldn't outlast written records for long. Stories tied to the Great Barrier Reef describe dry land far offshore. That land is now covered entirely by open ocean water. In 2015, geographer Patrick Nunn published research on this exact question. His work appeared in the journal Australian Geographer, cross-checking dozens of stories. He compared these stories directly against hard sea level data. The coastlines described match-documented flooding events from 7,000 years ago. Some events date back as far as 18,000 years remarkably. That means specific stories were transmitted accurately for roughly 300 generations. Nunn's research points to deliberate cultural mechanisms behind this accuracy. Repetition, ceremony, and strict correction by elders kept the details intact. His team compared story details against seafloor coring and dated sediment. This wasn't loose guesswork or vague symbolic matching either. In several cases, described landmarks lined up with submerged features precisely. Similar flood memory patterns exist in oral traditions from other coastal cultures. This suggests Australia's case isn't an isolated cultural fluke either. Similar accuracy has since been checked and confirmed in parts of North America too. Your own culture likely holds a flood story too, somewhere in its past. Some of these stories may be older and truer than assumed. Before you close this tab, sit with that number. 300 generations of verified, accurate memory. Remember what I said at the start of this file. 2 cases remain, and one of them is the one I mentioned. Case 7. Ancient Egypt, documented in the Edwin Smith Papyrus, roughly 1600 BCE. Egyptian healers applied copper directly onto open wounds. They also stored drinking water specifically in copper vessels, not clay. They had no concept of germs, bacteria, or microbiology at any level. They had no laboratory, no microscope, no written theory of disease at all. They simply observed a pattern repeated across many generations of practice. Copper containers behaved differently. Copper-treated wounds seemed to fester less often. This same practice spread independently across India, Greece, and later Aztec medicine. None of these cultures had any contact with each other on this specific practice. Ancient Persians reportedly used copper vessels too, for long desert journeys. Their water stayed drinkable far longer than water stored in other containers. Modern microbiology confirms copper ions rupture bacterial cell membranes on contact. Many microbes die within minutes of touching a copper surface. Copper also interferes directly with bacterial DNA, preventing further reproduction. In 2008, the EPA registered copper alloys as a new antimicrobial category. It was the first solid antimicrobial material class regulators had recognized. No plastic, no fabric, no other solid surface had earned that status before. Hospitals now install copper alloy surfaces on doorknobs and bed rails. This targets the exact effect ancient Egyptian healers relied on. Unnamed. Studies show copper surfaces in intensive care units reduce infection rates sharply. Some reduce hospital-acquired infections by more than half. In measured trials, the EPA registration now covers hundreds of specific copper alloys. That regulatory category simply didn't exist before that particular ruling. Some transit systems now install copper handrails quietly. For this exact reason, most riders never notice why the metal was chosen. It is the same reason Egyptian healers reached for it. 4,000 years earlier, they couldn't see the bacteria dying. They could see, generation after generation, that copper simply won. One case remains. This is the one I mentioned at the start. Case 8, multiple prehistoric sites, Europe and South America. Trepanation, dating back over 7,000 years. Prehistoric healers cut circular openings into living human skulls. Sometimes they performed this procedure more than once on the same patient. Early archaeologists assumed the practice was purely ceremonial, nothing medical. They assumed almost none of the patients could have actually survived it. No anesthesia, as we understand it, existed anywhere at that time. No antibiotics existed. No sterile instruments existed, either. The working assumption for decades was simple: ritual mutilation, not medicine. Early textbooks even described the practice as a purely symbolic act, nothing clinical. Bioarchaeologists studying thousands of recovered skulls found something unexpected. Many trepanation sites show smooth, rounded, fully healed bone growth. That kind of healing only forms if the patient survived for months. In some cases, patients clearly survived for years after the surgery. Survival estimates at several well-studied sites run above 50%. This was achieved using only sharpened stone and obsidian tools. Bioarchaeologist John Verano at Tulane University has studied hundreds of these skulls. His research tracks survival rates across different historical eras in Peru. Survival rates actually improved over centuries. According to his findings, that suggests surgeons refined technique through direct, accumulated hands-on experience. Likely reasons for the surgery include trauma, seizures, and relentless headaches. Wear patterns around each opening support these specific medical explanations. Similar practices appear independently in Neolithic France, a separate continent entirely. This technique was developed separately at least twice, worlds apart. The final piece of evidence is the hardest to explain fully. Some skulls show clear signs of a second, separate, fully healed surgery. That patient came back, willingly, for the exact same procedure again. Whatever pain drove them back, they trusted stone tools more than the pain. Modern neurosurgeons still drill small holes, called burr holes, into skulls. It is the same basic reason relieving dangerous pressure inside the head. They opened a living human skull with stone tools. People walked out afterward more than once. That was the case I couldn't stop thinking about. 8 objects, 8 different centuries, cultures, and continents entirely. One single pattern runs quietly underneath every one of them. None of this was luck. None of it was mysticism. It wasn't magic, and it wasn't a lucky accident repeated 8 separate times. It was patient observation, tested, and repeated for centuries at a time. Longer, in some cases, than most modern nations have even existed. We labeled it superstition mainly because we arrived generations too late. The real testing was already finished by the time we noticed. The instruments came later. The knowledge was already sitting there, waiting case file. Number 7, closed. Which one of these 8 would you have dismissed first? Tell me exactly which one in the comments below this video. I will read every single answer personally this week. Next time, I am opening a file on objects we admit are strange. We still haven't fully explained a single one of them. This is Professor Detective. Stay curious. The truth is always hiding in plain sight.